I would like to share a few musical memories with Alfred Brendel. Over the years, the time that we spent together in his studio was a central point in my life. We arranged to meet there quite regularly, I would say around 5 to 10 times a year, whenever both of our concert schedules allowed us to be in London at the same time. In a series of 2 or 3 afternoons, I would come to him in Hampstead and play a selection of music. In my estimation, the music that I played was 30% pieces that he had specifically requested. Let's say 40% pieces that I would choose from his preferred concert repertoire. So, as we all know, composers like Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Liszt. 30 or 20% music that we knew he loved but did not actively perform that much, such as Bach, Chopin, Bartók, Ligeti. And the remaining 10% was repertoire that was perhaps even unfamiliar to him and which I brought along to arouse his curiosity on the day, which was often a very interesting thing to do. In the time that was available, he commented really to his heart's content on every piece that I played. He said many insightful, inspiring, useful things. It's difficult, but I'll try to give you an idea by categorizing these comments, and maybe for each category, let me try to include an example that is not generally known. There were, for example, personal convictions about the overall picture corresponding to a bit or a piece of music, like the D major fugue of the second book of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, being for him a piece for brass instruments. I suppose this is could be considered a highly interesting and thought-provoking minority view. Then there are suggestions, especially for techniques or for ideas and images, whose application he often left to my imagination and discretion. Well, there's one such technique which, as far as I know, he did not really go into any detail about in his books, where he wrote many of his ideas about music and musical interpretation. It's irrational or aleatoric changes in dynamics and in tone color for creating what he called atmospheric playing. That is, one would not try to follow the shape of the music, but rather do things which did not correspond to the music. And in doing so, one created the impression of something elemental, something natural. I remember him telling me that in the context of a piece by Debussy. Well, there were, of course, also a lot of little tricks and quirks. I suppose we can skip those as they are, well, they're interesting but not essential. What was really essential and to which the bulk of the time was devoted was a very detailed process of setting the building blocks of an interpretation and adjusting each one, theme by theme, measure by measure, sometimes note by note. And this process was not a process of explanation, but rather more illustration followed by interactive shaping. The point was very often not what he said, but rather when. That is, not the instructions themselves, but the situations which led him to pronounce them, reacting to what he just heard. That was the essence of his teaching. The interpretations, as one might call them, created during these sessions in such a way were artworks in and of themselves. In my own public concerts, I created my own. I did my own thing. For me, as a performing musician, there could be no question of that. And therefore, I guess I rarely truly exposed or presented these Brendel studio artworks, these artworks in which he himself had a direct hand. When I talk about this way, The thought comes to me that many piano teachers, especially the typical routine, experienced piano teachers, might consider this kind of approach, this kind of willfulness, one might call it, ungrateful or uncooperative. But I believe in Mr. Brendel's at least tacit acceptance, with his having attended no small number of my concerts over the years. Well, once he did tell me, I didn't like that, please just use mine. The value I gained was, I guess, in the end, because of what I just said, not in his producing templates that I would receive from his hand and be able to use. Rather, the gift that he entrusted to me was something much deeper. I got to experience making music under his vision. Well, let me try to describe this vision. To me, in what I perceived, he was an instinctive musician. Instinctive in the sense that feeling was the primary motivation. But the really important thing was that these instincts were shaped by musicological knowledge and by cultural erudition. So what was important was the way that this feeling, which was the primary motivation, was then refined. The process of refinement, as I said, includes the application of musicological knowledge, so avoiding anything that one knew to be wrong, to put it a bit reductively. That basically meant not just avoiding it consciously, but priming one's intuition in such a way that the things that one knew were wrong came to truly feel wrong. So in a sense, putting one's knowledge into one's intuition and having this be so perfectly integrated. The other part of the process of refinement, which is really an all-encompassing part, is enriching the feeling through comparison with other experiences from various fields of humanities. Fictional literature, visual art, these were particular sources of Mr. Brendel's interpretations and the way he described music. His most fundamental element was, as he called it, character. A phrase had a character, a theme had a character, which made it into something like a person in a novel. One would get a sense of a personality and how it might interact with other characters. Literature, especially what he called the great classic literature, informed his sense of how the juxtaposition and the development of these characters in a music piece could be psychologically convincing. He liked using this phrase, psychologically convincing, to describe what he aimed for. I guess a simple way to put it would be the idea that something felt logical or something felt right in the moment that it happened. In visual art, I feel it was his love of expressionist art among his loves for many kinds of art forms and styles that accorded most with his musical style. Expression was usually linked to, to intent, to effort, and to a real commitment. Now, without these things, the result would be what he called perfunctory. Even something like grace was not for him just the expression of effortlessness. In general, I would say that he took care to make any potential banalities into things that were poetic. And only after succeeding at this, or after trying it, and making everything indeed poetic, there would sometimes be a moment of reflection where his aesthetic sense would deem the result, as he often said, as he often called it, too complicated, and demand a more straightforward way of executing the passage. I remember, for example, this phrase in the Schumann concerto, piano concerto, where this sequence probably seemed to him at first glance a bit banal, so he wanted to really dig into these harmonies and find their differences and make something very meaningful out of it. And then once he heard it through the CD player, and he said that was too complicated. Well, these words that I've been throwing around a bit are words that he himself often used in these incredible hours in his studio, where I had this privilege of being, in a sense, his hands, operating under the guidance of his mind that was shaped by a lifetime spent with the great artworks and the cultural artifacts of human history. Although Mr. Brendel was curious about nature and science, indeed he would often express real honest amazement, and I remember he excitedly telling me about experiments on octopuses that he had read about. But his artistic inspirations, references, and core values were, I think, firmly centered on what we call nowadays humanities. Perhaps that's where he and I were quite we're a bit different. You know, I come from an environment with low context values. I see the world through logic, through empiricism, through the mental structure of Western science. So through Mr. Brendel, my vision of life expanded. He showed me another world in which it is possible to have intellectual stimulation and fulfillment through culture. As you might imagine, certain recent developments in the outside world, maybe not that one, were not necessarily to Mr. Brendel's liking. But what I always admired and what I was very happy for is that he remained until the end, I believe, immune to a state of mind of general embitterment, having known certain people who, especially in their later years, fell victim to such a state of mind. I think this is thanks to the enormous pleasure that Mr. Brendel continued to take in the world that he created and curated for himself. He once told me, quite recently actually, aesthetic things and the pleasure in them are what make life worth living. I thank him for sharing this viewpoint with me through his living example and through having invited me to take a peek into his sanctuary. I've shared a few things with you, but what I cannot relate to you and what it's not my place to share is my experience of his personal generosity. This is something which will always stay with me, and in this particular moment in time must have particular precedence in my thoughts towards Mr. Brendel. This generosity leaves me with a debt of gratitude which I can hardly describe, much less repay in words.